Well, hello, everybody. My name is Susan Tanner. I'm the current vice chair of the group of 78. And I have a background in both law and environment. And I was present in Rio when they signed as executive director of Friends of the Earth, when they signed these documents, the climate change policy and the biodiversity policy. And at that time, we were very hopeful. And now I think with what Sephora has to tell us, we are once again hopeful. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'll just introduce to you my co-moderator, Leah. I can't say enough good about Leah. She has been contributing member of Group of 78 while she is a student. She's recently graduated from NIPSIA, Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, but she's moving to England for love. She will be continuing to participate with us online. And I have to say, if any of you haven't an online job, paying job, of course, she would be very good for it. Excellent. So I'm going to ask Leah, please, to do our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Susan. Everyone, I don't know how much I owe you for that wonderful introduction. Um, but yeah, this is a real honor for me to be co-moderating this. Zipporah, you were one of the first speakers that I heard when I first joined the group of 78, and it was just utterly fascinating to hear such a high level of enthusiasm despite the way that the world is going. So it's conversations like this that make me really excited to be a part of this. But as we talk about questions of fossil fuel transition and global responsibility, I really want to center our conversation in acknowledging the land on which we are sitting. So today, I'm personally joining from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Wherever you are joining from, it's important that we recognize and honor the enduring peace and stewardship of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and around the world. I ask that during and after this session, we can try and reflect on the ways that conversations about climate, land, transitions, and resources are inseparable from questions of Indigenous sovereignty and responsibility. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, but I would also like to just remind everyone that this is taking place within ongoing histories and present realities of unequal relationships to land and power. So that's just how I would like to frame this conversation. And thank you all for joining us, and especially to support for taking the time out of what has been overly busy month for you. So thank you.
A very busy month. So I wanted to introduce you just briefly, Svora, although I know many of our members know you well. But I wanted to say that you are a far greater Canadian hero for me than even our delightful astronaut, Steve Hansen, who recently circled the moon, because whereas Hansen talks about the beauty of our planet, you, without the support of NASA, have found a way for concerned, ambitious countries and others to work together to save that beautiful planet from the huge negative impacts of fossil fuels. And your method involves all key stakeholders, not just nation states, but substantial subnational governments, Indigenous organizations, and NGOs, international civil society in general. And as the founder of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and a key force behind the recent groundbreaking conference, we're looking forward to hearing how how the Santa Marta, Colombia agreement can work and how we can support it. Now, I was going to say how we can support it, and I just received something coming across from Liz Bernstein said we should all join and support the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. So we can talk about that near the end if we like. Sadly, our own government seems to be going in the wrong direction on a number of fronts. And environmentalists are outraged. Although Canada had a token presence in Santa Marta, it's nowhere near ambitious, quote unquote, to reduce fossil fuel consumption. In fact, just the opposite, as we seem to have been seduced recently into increasing supply as a result of the problem with the Strait of Hormuz, as a result of the war with Israel and the US and Iran. The current problem there highlights the global addiction to fossil fuels and its economic consequences, but does not address the problems such as affecting human health, creating weather weirding, as Catherine Hayhoe refers to it, the global and threatening continuation of human life on the planet. In fact, reports of the Santa Marta Conference provide hope for change. Thank goodness. And we're looking forward to hearing about the practical plans, the inspiration for countries to follow, and how we can help. So thank you very much. Our conversation today will start with a few remarks from Sephora and then questions from our attendees. Leah and I each have a question to start with, and then we will go to the questions in the Q&A. I'm advised to reinforce the fact that it's the Q&A and not the chat, because there's apparently frequently problems between the two. So please, Sephora, take it over.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here. I thought I might just start by giving a little bit of background around where this conference came from and why I think it is so important. Some people, are already saying, well, it's just a conference. Why is that important? When we first started thinking about having a standalone diplomatic conference outside of the UN space on fossil fuel phase out, it was probably 4 years ago. When a group of us were researching the history of landmines and chemical weapons and nuclear nonproliferation, we studied actually 5 other treaties to try and look at how issues that were really intransigent within the UN system, because there are vested interests that stand to benefit from the status quo that were kind of constraining the conversation, like fossil fuels inside the climate negotiations. What happened then? Many of you will know that we've spent 30 years negotiating on climate change, and I myself, I think I've been to 17 or something conference of parties on climate change. And it really, yeah, 17. It really wasn't until Glasgow about 5 years ago that we even started having a conversation on fossil fuels, which is crazy, right? The oil, gas, and coal are 86% of the carbon emissions that are currently trapped in our atmosphere and causing climate change and extreme weather, and the floods and the fires that we're all experiencing, and especially now the lethal heat around the planet. But we weren't talking about fossil fuels. And in Glasgow, we launched a campaign, which was actually called It's Time to Say the F Words at COP, trying to really force a conversation about fossil fuels inside the climate negotiations. It took many years, but in Dubai at the Conference of Parties, we finally got 190 countries to acknowledge in the text that we needed a fossil fuel phase out. Just having those words, fossil fuels, in the text, no plans, no commitments, no targets for phase out, but just getting those words was a massive political fight. And it really was, it helped us to realize that with so many fossil fuel lobbyists, outnumbering many countries, for example, so much history of fossil fuels being invisible in these conversations, with a process, and this is important, a process that is by consensus. So 30 years ago, Saudi Arabia intervened on the rules for the United Nations Framework on Climate Change and proposed that it be by consensus. When you have a UN process that's by consensus, then every word needs to be negotiated. Saudi Arabia would have to agree, and the US, when it was part of it, would have to agree to every single word. And it's part of how they have systemically weakened any conversation about fossil fuel production. The industry strategy for years has been really clear. Go ahead, talk about emissions, feel guilty for your use of fossil fuels, and focus on your use of fossil fuels, but don't constrain production. There should be no framework to constrain the production of fossil fuels. And of course, the problem with that is that what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. The new LNG plants, the new pipelines, the new oil drilling, those are our future emissions. So we keep building more and more of it. We're on track to build 120% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 2 degrees. And yet, so we keep building more of it, and then we say we have emissions targets to reduce emissions. It just doesn't add up. So what we did is we proposed to the countries who are currently working on a fossil fuel treaty, which would be a companion to the Paris Agreement that addresses the production and phase out of fossil fuel supply and emissions. We proposed to those countries that there be a standalone diplomatic conference outside of the UN, similar to what Canada did actually on landmines, the Ottawa Convention. Convene countries, a kind of coalition of the ambitious. I like to say that instead of coalition of the willing, because there's a lot of countries that say they're willing, but they're not ambitious. Canada's one of them. But a coalition of the ambitious that would come together and start to really have a conversation, not about whether we need to phase out fossil fuels, but how. This was proposed formally to the ministers at the table at the Fossil Fuel Treaty about a year and a half ago. They agreed. And then in Belém, Colombia and the Netherlands agreed to host it. At that point, it became a bit of a different conference. And I want to be clear, this was not a fossil fuel treaty fossil fuel phase out. So the idea of a fossil fuel treaty and new legally binding mechanisms and the kind of governance gap that we see was certainly one of the solutions that was discussed. But the conference was much bigger. It was also about, agreements that stand in the way of countries stopping fossil fuel expansion, like the ISDS rules. It was about fossil fuel subsidies. It was about many issues. And so Colombia and the Netherlands agreed to host it. They announced that in Belém. And then we all, many of us as organizations trying to support the countries and the countries themselves started designing this conference. In 5 months, we designed and pulled off a conference with 60 countries at a high level, ministers and deputy ministers and climate envoys. Not only was there a 2-day high-level conference in Santa Marta where countries really not only gave statements about fossil fuel phase-out, but actually sat in working groups and talked about how to do fossil fuel phase-out and what they would need to do together. But also what grew up around the conference was a series of other conferences. So there was an academic and science conference on fossil fuel phase-out, a union roundtable, Indigenous Peoples Forum, a People's Summit, the subnational so cities and states forum, independent parliamentarians. And I saw here on your participant list that Rosa Galvez is here. Hi, Rosa. She played an important role at that Parliamentarians Forum for a Fossil-Free Future. So it really was the first time that many groups around the world came together with governments to talk about how to do fossil fuel phase out. And I think, and I'll end here and open it up to questions, but probably one of the most important things that happened was a commitment for this process to continue. So there was a real push inside the conference for the momentum on fossil fuels to go back inside the UNFCCC so that agreements can only be voluntary, so that they can continue to be weakened. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be more ambition on fossil fuel phase out inside the UNFCCC process. There should. And countries should do national roadmaps on fossil fuel phase out, and that should be part of what they submit inside the UNFCCC in their nationally determined contributions. It should be part of the global stocktake, and there should be more ambition and work groups within the Brazilian roadmap process. So there's a number of existing processes that can be strengthened and can include fossil fuel phase out. but it's not enough. Because if what we do is only inside that process, we know it will move slowly. We know the big producers who stand to benefit will slow any agreements down. And we know there won't be new international cooperation and architecture, and it won't be legally binding. And those issues are really important because wealthy countries can produce their own phase out plans for fossil fuels. Canada could. While, of course, it's not going to be easy to stop expanding the production and ensure a wind down, it is entirely possible, economically possible, and physically possible without significant disruptions to Canada's GDP. And if we manage the decline, that we can ensure that workers and communities aren't left behind. An unmanaged decline is more dangerous. But for most countries in the world, for most countries in the global south, they can't do it alone because they're drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon or fracking gas and then doing LNG and proposing new LNG production from Argentina to Nigeria, in large part, just to feed their debt. Our financial architecture and system is pushing more fossil fuel production and dependency. So for many countries, they can't just stop producing. And in fact, they're being told that they have to increase production by the IMF if they want to get their loans this year. So we need systemic changes to the financial architecture to support countries in leaving carbon in the ground and doing that phase out. And that's going to require international cooperation between countries. And that's why I'm so excited that the second international conference on fossil fuel phase out has already been announced. It will be hosted by Tuvalu in the Pacific and co-hosted by Ireland and will happen in 2027. So this is now not a one-off. It's a standalone diplomatic conference with countries who are willing to actually start planning on fossil fuel phase out.
Susan, you are on mute, just so you know.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Deborah. It was wonderful. You speak so with such passion and such clarity. It's wonderful. I'm going to ask Leah to ask her first question now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really also glad to see that Rosa Galvez is here. She said something recently at Parliament that really stuck with me, which is just that the urgency is no longer being driven only by the climate science and the activists, but it's also the economics and the geopolitics and the financial risks. So I think it's interesting, maybe slowly seeing a bit of a momentum coming from insurers and financial regulators who are also seeing fossil fuels as a systemic risk. So I'm personally hoping that that can kind of create a shift from the cost of transition to the cost of not transitioning. My first question for you, Zipporah, was one of the things that was repeatedly emphasized was at the Santa Marta was a safe space for candid collaboration and cooperation. I would say the safe space just by having all these different organizations and countries and parts of civil society be able to come together and have this, I guess, more honest discussion about what is not happening, about what needs to be done. But in an environment where fossil fuel interests obviously do exert enormous influence over climate policy, how do you see that space being protected and sustain that momentum moving forward?
Well, I think that what's really important is who's in the room. And also whether or not the process includes conversations that are not live streamed, that are not performative. What we often see within the UN spaces is very much a performative conversation. Countries are making their statements, and those statements are they don't get, shocks on their interest rates, that companies, fossil fuel companies, don't start pulling out quickly, or what we say in policy spaces and international diplomacy has a significant effect on markets, on financial architecture, and we can't forget that this literally is the most powerful industry in the history of the world. It's the most profitable. one of the most profitable industries in the history of the world. Like the fossil fuel industry makes $2.8 billion a day in pure profit every day for the past 50 years. So they have enormous amounts of money to also overwhelm processes, to have more reports that benefit their outcomes, to have more proposals on the table, and which especially overwhelms a lot of countries that actually don't have a lot of capacity. Before I started working on the fossil fuel treaty and meeting with many countries in the global south, I really didn't understand how bare bones some of these countries are. You know, a minister will have 40 files and have one policy person to work with on them. So if they get overwhelmed with proposals and they get, it's very difficult for them to feed through. It's very easy for the fossil fuel industry to overwhelm proposals and capture them and capture processes. And that's what's been happening. So in Santa Marta, you first of all, you had a gate to entry. There weren't fossil fuel lobbyists there. There weren't the big producers there. The US was not invited. Saudi Arabia was not invited, etc. I think we're going to see that even more in the coming conferences. I've already talked to Minister Mena from Tuvalu. He's very interested in producing really transparent criteria who can come and really looking at what does it mean to be a coalition of the ambitious. Like, not every country can say, okay, we'll stop expansion, because the science says no new expansion. If we want to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need no new expansion of fossil fuel projects anywhere. And we need to manage a wind down. Now, how fast that wind down happens for each country depends, because if, for example, Canada was able to wind down quicker because we had the economic prosperity to allow that kind of faster managed decline, and we do have a historic responsibility given the responsibility that we have that wealthy countries have for the carbon that is currently trapped into our atmosphere, and also for the economic benefit that we've received from production so far. If you take equity and justice into account, then many countries in the global south should have a more gentle wind down, also because they need it. Some countries, fossil fuel exports are so big a part of their GDP that if they just stopped expansion and started a fast wind down, it would be devastating to their social services and their economy. That's not true of Australia, Norway, Canada. It's actually a great report written by the Civil Society Equity Review Group on how you would design equity in production decline. We're taking a lot of knowledge and information from that. But so at Santa Marta, you had some closed spaces. You not only had, criteria of who was there, but you had closed spaces that were Chatham House rules, where it could only be governments and close advisors. And I think when I talk to people coming out of those conversations, they just felt freed. One minister said to me, that was the most imaginative and interesting conversation I've ever had. Like, I can see how we can do it now. And I think that's really critical. Like, and I heard that from the Indigenous spaces. I heard it from the academic spaces as well, that the idea that people were freed of having to argue that we need fossil fuel phase out. Instead, having a place where they weren't worried about who was in the room and who was going to attack them, and they could literally just brainstorm together and imagine what they need, what architecture needs to be created to ensure a fossil fuel phase out. I think one of the most dangerous things that the industry has done actually is stolen our imagination to imagine a fossil-free world. We not only by their capturing of a lot of the political systems and the policy spaces, but also by a relentless advertising, billions of dollars in advertising that makes us believe that makes us fear fossil fuel phase out, that we're all going to freeze in the dark and prices are going to be so high and you won't have your IV bags at the hospital or your cell phone. There's this, you are dependent on us, you need us. It's going to be terrible for you if we aren't there. And you see that advertising in every country I'm in various ways. And so it has constrained our ability to actually imagine what it's like without fossil fuel industry. And on that note, I'll say one more thing, which is just that we don't have to replace 100% of the fossil fuels that are currently being produced. And I think it's really critical for people to understand how doable this actually is. About 63% of all of the fossil fuels that are dug up out of the ground and transported around the planet are just to produce and use more fossil fuels. It's the most inefficient system in the world. We only use 37% of the fossil fuels that are produced for our heating and our transport and our electricity. And the best example of that is shipping. Almost 50% of the ships currently moving on the surface of the planet are just moving fossil fuels around. So if we phase out fossil fuels, we need 50% less shipping. A lot of people don't understand that actually it's a system designed to keep us dependent on the system and continue to reproduce itself. And and when I was talking to some of the ministers about that, like, let's talk about replacing the 37%. Let's talk about what your barriers are to stopping expanding that production. It was such a generative conversation because for many countries like Canada, it's not about replacing fossil fuels with renewables. It's about replacing export revenue because we're exporting the majority of the fossil fuels we produce. So actually, the problem has been defined wrong. It's about ensuring economic diversification and competitive and other competitive industries. And that's a really critical conversation for a lot of the countries that I'm working with in Africa, because yes, they need more energy infrastructure, but they also just really need to be not having to mine for. It's about replacing those export revenues. And once we kind of pared back the conversation, there's a lot of opportunities there for them to do that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Susan, I don't know if you want to ask your question, but if you do, you are on mute still. The joys of
There you
on.
go. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Svara. You actually started in on answering my next question, which was, I'm very interested in how the conference can inspire other countries, even perhaps some who were not there. And how is the front runner cooperation going to impact other countries who weren't there? And how do you see that playing out? Will there be more countries you think might sign up for the next year's meeting? And if so, how will that be handled? And yeah, please, thank you.
It's a great question. I think there's two things that are happening and that are really, well, really three things. One is the narrative shift that happened as a result of this conference. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that. For the first time ever, countries convened to talk about fossil fuel phase out. It's historic. And it's not, what I'm starting to see is that recognition isn't just in media articles now about the conference, it's in everything. So there's an article that I read over the weekend in the Financial Times about something Trump was doing. And, and somewhere down in the middle of the article, there was like, however, 60 countries have just met to plan fossil fuel phase out. So there's a number of countries that believe that it is possible and necessary. And so that shifts everything because before it was scientists, it was civil society, it was, pushing that there needed to be a fossil fuel phase out. To have 60 countries saying, of course, yes, we agree and we need to plan for it, shifts the conversations significantly. And that narrative shift is critical. The industry was responsible for a similar narrative shift on the other side in the early 90s, late 80s. So when climate change was first discovered and people started talking about it in the 70s, it was acknowledged in the newspaper. This is happening because of fossil fuels. We need to slow down the production of oil, gas, and coal. It was everywhere. And that narrative changed. It changed in the late 80s, early 90s as a result of a concerted push by the fossil fuel industry to take fossil fuels out of the conversation. It's a great documentary actually called The White House Effect that you can really see this, and that I recently saw, that you can see that narrative shift. So we have been now successful in kind of pulling back the curtain and pushing fossil fuels back at front and center into the development of policy, the development of international negotiations. And I think that's really critical. Secondly, leadership matters. When you look throughout history on other intransigent issues, leadership matters, because many countries are now looking at this going, oh, they're really going for it. 2, 3, 4 years ago, when I first started meeting with, well, probably 5 years ago, when I first started meeting with countries on the fossil fuel phase out and fossil fuel production and supply, I would get a lot of, I know you're right. I mean, I see the science, you're right, but I mean, we couldn't, we're afraid to address this. We couldn't, we'll have, it's too big of a backlash in our country, or other countries will be mad at us, or we just have to focus on the architecture we already created at Paris. And that's just about emissions and target support. It's not about production. And so there was just a fear. And I think courage is contagious. And it's something to have, 5, 10, now 18 countries at the table for the fossil fuel treaty. Something else to have 60 countries saying publicly, we need to stop expanding fossil fuels. We need to phase out production and emissions, which is what we saw from the main high-level dialogue in Santa Marta. And many countries, wealthy countries, global south countries, Latin America, Africa, Europe, Caribbean, it was pretty impressive. And so I think that leadership will start to create a wave. Whether there's more countries or less at the second conference, to be honest, I'm not sure. Because if Tuvalu and Ireland decide on criteria that requires countries to commit that they will align production with Paris goals, that means no new expansion. Well, you had Australia and Canada in Santa Marta. Australia and Canada couldn't come if there was a commitment to no new expansion. I think what's critical is, as the criteria heightens to reflect the science, that there's also a recognition of equity and of differentiated responsibility and capacity. What I mean by that is, I would think it's okay for Nigeria to be there, or Ecuador, if they're saying, we would like to stop expansion, but we can't until there's greater international cooperation and help with removing some of these barriers. And because, that's when Colombia announced that they were joining the fossil fuel treaty, President Petro said, we know every day we're making the problem worse and we can't stop. And we need your help. We have to have international cooperation to stop. By acknowledging that he wanted to stop expansion, that the science demands it, that if he's going to keep his people safe, he has to stop expanding fossil fuels. That was a game changer globally. He was one of the first countries to do that. And so I think we're going to see more countries doing that from the global south. Whether or not you continue to have big producers there from the global north, I'm unclear on that. And not just producers. I started to see a real split in Santa Marta between wealthy European countries and some of the global south countries, because I heard a lot from some of the wealthy European countries, well, we just want national roadmaps. This process should go back inside the UNFCCC and we should all design our national policies. Well, again, most countries in the global south can't do that on their own. And wealthy countries can do that. But also, I think it's interesting that some of the European countries were saying, they want it to go back inside the UNFCCC, where those timelines are voluntary, where there is no new legally binding architecture. And I think it's because the current architecture benefits them. And it's time. It's time for new financial architecture and proposals to come from the global south, to shift what is actually a. So I hope the group grows. I hope it grows with more countries from the global south, definitely more countries from Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. I'm not sure yet about Europe and other global north countries, but I think how it's going to play out may be similar to what we see through history. The landmines originally had 20, 30 countries. Today there's 160 countries. Because once they created that framework, that legally binding framework, and they designed it to be really ambitious, they locked it. It was voted on. And then they locked the agreement. And then it went back inside the UN. It's referred to in political theory as the build it and they will come model. So it's not a consensus tree that's continually developed. And it's another model. It's a, here it is, you can join it if you want. Well, there were benefits to joining it. Because if you didn't join it, you didn't get those agreements on like on the fossil fuel treaty, there are trade and tax and market access agreements and debt relief agreements that are all being designed right now by the lawyers and experts, finance experts at the table. So the countries that are at the table will design the treaty. Then once it's locked and other countries are invited to join, they will see some benefit to it. And what happened in those other treaties is that's when you saw more and more countries coming on board. And I think finally, the other lesson that I'm taking from history is that some of the big countries never joined, but they changed their practices because those treaties shifted the social norm of what was acceptable in other foreign policy debates. It became unacceptable for a country to want support from other countries on X issue if they were still stockpiling nuclear weapons. So, or if they were still stockpiling landmines. So could this agreement on a fossil fuel treaty, which is not being negotiated through the Santa Marta process, but it's laying the table for the growth of that, I believe. And once we start negotiating it, could it actually impact other bilateral and plurilateral agreements because it's shifted the norm of what's acceptable on fossil fuel expansion? I think it could.
Fabulous. Thank you. Now that sequences very well into a question I know that is waiting. So Leah, do you want to take over the Q&As?
Yeah, I mean, we have, oh, sorry, that's my cat trying to come into my room if there's any noise. He just does his own thing. I'm just going to go in the order that we have the questions coming in, and I might group together a couple of them just because we have quite a few. So the first one that we have is from Rosa Galvez, and she says that following the momentum we witnessed in Santa Marta, where countries increasingly frame the transition away from fossil fuels not only as a climate imperative, but also an economic and geopolitical necessity, what concrete leadership roles do you believe Canada could realistically play in advancing an international framework for a managed fossil fuel phase out, while ensuring a just transition for workers, Indigenous communities, and resource-dependent regions?
It's a great question, Rosa. And I fear we're going right now in Canada in the wrong direction. I'll just say it out loud. Like I'm so disappointed in the Carney administration on climate. In some ways, I expected him, given the threat of Trump and everything that's going on in geopolitics, to avoid constraints to the oil and gas sector. Didn't expect him to double down on eliminating other climate laws and policies, especially on the demand side. I find it very strange. And also on the building of new infrastructure, the underwriting LNG terminals, new pipelines, etc. But it's if we spend billions of dollars on a piece of infrastructure, that infrastructure is not to produce fossil fuels for 5 years or 10 years. It's to produce fossil fuels for 30 to 40 years. He knows the science. If we're producing this much or more fossil fuels in 40 years, then we're ensuring the majority of the planet is uninhabitable for future generations. Like it's that clear now. There is already one person dying every minute on this planet due to lethal heat. We're spending $16 million an hour right now on the planet on extreme weather. And that is increasing, especially with what we're facing with the super El Nino next year. And so the idea that we're underwriting and building so much more is, I find, quite devastating. And the subsidies to the industry, Canada and other big countries like Australia are keeping our fossil fuel industry alive. Like, people need to understand that renewable energy at scale is much cheaper now than fossil fuels. And so the only way for fossil fuels to stay alive, especially new projects and infrastructure, is subsidies and tax breaks and support, because they can't compete in the market anymore. And unfortunately, we're seeing those increase, not just in Canada, but in many countries around the world. And, and not just in the subsidies. Now there's literally direct financing. In 2024, Canada gave something like $29.6 billion to fossil fuel companies of taxpayer money for pipelines and CCS and LNG financing. So That's not the leadership. Okay, but that said, what could Canada do? I think with the US moving so quickly out of international aid and support spaces, there's massive gaps. I mean, literally, people are dying because of US aid just closing their doors. And so there is a piece that it's not my area of expertise, but there is a piece in international support and aid that also can be redirected for the infrastructure that is needed to address supply constraints and price constraints. So what I mean by that is there are countries that could right now get off fossil fuels and they could provide necessary services to their people that they can't. But there's critical pieces of infrastructure that are needed in order to do that. It's in the electrification network. It's in et cetera. So creating a process where you focus on those critical pieces of infrastructure to ensure fossil fuel phase out as support to countries that are in crisis, I think would be a really smart place for Carney to lean in, because it wouldn't result in a backlash domestically from the oil industry or Alberta. And it would have a significant effect on reducing emissions and right now saving a lot of lives. So I think the question of how we use our funds internationally, both as aid and as investment, is really important. I think in Canada, I think it's critical with the super El Nino we're facing for the government to lean in to adaptation and preparation. And that is an important leadership role as well. We are past the point where we can just talk about phase out and mitigation as the primary climate responsibilities. In the coming year, people will lose their homes and their livelihoods and possibly their lives as a result of heat waves, as a result of fires, as a result of scarcity. We can see it coming, and that means our governments, who are there to protect the public good, should be planning for that. And that means cooling centers. It means food systems and water systems. It means more money into flood protection. It means a lot more money into fires. And I'm not seeing that right now. And quite honestly, as a Canadian and as a mother, that is terrifying me. This will likely be one of the worst fire seasons or worst fire years the world has ever seen. As a result of what's brewing right now in our oceans, and we should be preparing for that. And then, in my mind's eye, a real concrete role would be for Canada to do what Colombia is doing. Like, honestly, that's what Canada has to do. We have to be one of the wealthy countries that acknowledges the science, that we are going to have to stop expanding and manage a wind down. The idea that, and many Canadian ministers have said this to me, we know the world needs to phase out fossil fuels and use less oil, but as long as it is using oil, might as well use ours. If every country thinks like that, then we produce and use too much to ensure a safe planet. That's the bottom line. We have to think cooperatively. We have to work with other countries within a global carbon budget, because the atmosphere doesn't know political boundaries. This is physics. It's about how much carbon is being trapped in our atmosphere. And today, more carbon is being trapped in our atmosphere faster than at any other point in history. So every single fossil fuel project that is approved in this country costs lives. That's the bottom line. And it will make the problem worse. So he's got to stop expanding. And the longer we wait to say that we need a managed decline, the more likely an unmanaged decline as a result of price shocks, as a result of wars, as a result of the uncertainty of the fossil fuel system, the longer that happens. And I want to say a couple things on the war and the crisis. The industry is using this to say that therefore we need to produce more. And The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz isn't a disruption of the system. It's a revelation of how broken the system already is. It doesn't weaken the case for phase out. It makes it undeniable. And the difference between this oil war and what happened in Venezuela this year, the oil wars, and previous oil wars, is that when those other ones happened, we didn't have solutions at scale. We have solutions at scale today that are cheaper for the majority of the uses of fossil fuels. And in fact, some countries are already deploying them at scale. 90% of the cars sold in Norway last year were electric. Globally, we're seeing this massive uptake in electric vehicles, and we can produce renewable energy now at scale to support whole countries. And so there is no excuse. Sure, there are some uses that we don't have solutions for. Aviation, it's like 2% of global emissions. We need to use fossil fuels for those cases, and we need to move quickly into electrification and renewable energy and energy efficiency in order to reduce what we have. But if we oversupply the system, which is what Canada is doing, we will continue to create demand. And for the first time this year, the industry acknowledged that. The mantra has always been that, well, we just feed demand. There's a demand, so we have to feed it. And the demand regulates how much supply is. So if people use less fossil fuels and emissions go down, supply will go down. No. Even when demand has flattened and gone down, supply has gone up. And for the first time this year, in a number of shareholder meetings, the oil industry was quoted as saying, now oversupply is creating demand. They're working now to keep their industry alive. I see it as, in the face of electric vehicles and cheap renewable energy, etc., this is the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry, and they're not going down without a fight.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate you being able to convey the urgency, but also, like what Susan mentioned earlier, just with such clarity, because I think this is what we need, is for everyone to be able to understand the points clearly, because it's confusing, but it also isn't. Sometimes the way forward is a bit less complicated than we worry about. So I'm gonna move on to the next question, if that's okay. If you're
Yeah,
if
it's
you're
true.
ready
I
for
just
that.
want to say, like, on your point, it is true that climate policy is complicated. And Rosa, I'm sorry, I didn't even get to finance. They should pass your bill. But what's not complicated is we have to stop building the bad stuff. We have to stop making the problem worse. And the fact that Canada says it's committed to fossil fuel phase out and climate leadership while building more and more of the problem is just absurd. And I hope that one thing that Santa Marta is doing is exposing that now to the world. You can't say you're transitioning out of something while you're.
Yeah. Well, that does lead perfectly into the next question that we have, which is on reforming financial architecture. Um, One of the questions here is, how can the international financial institutions like the World Bank or IMF, and multilateral development banks in Africa, Asia, Latin America support the transition to renewable energy and the elimination of fossil fuels? How can they do this while helping to eliminate the 1.3 trillion in debt owed by the poorest countries? How can sufficient financing also be mobilized to strengthen resilience to devastating climate change?
Oh, sorry. What a great question. The first thing that they need to do is stop making the problem worse. So this year we saw a number of cases where we were told by countries that they were told by the IMF, show us how much fossil fuel production you're going to increase, and fossil fuel exports in order to receive their loans. And this is absurd, right? Like we're actually having the financial institutions push countries to expand production at a time when the UN and all countries in the world have recognized we need to phase it out. And so and that's not because I don't think there's someone in the IMF going, we need more fossil fuels. It's actually because it's just a system designed to look at a country, look at their exports and say, okay, well, you have to meet this much money back to us. We're giving you a loan, increase your exports. So there, and so the systems themselves need to take the priority of fossil fuel phase out and climate urgency into the design of those systems. We also need countries to come together to push those institutions. For example, a reform of IMF special drawing rights. So at the fossil fuel treaty table, we're having discussions with countries about encouraging states to act, for example, on diverting their own allocations, creating political space for wider reform of international financial institutions. If countries come together as a bloc to push those international institutions, they can do that. Um, there could also be a range of options for national and international taxes and levies where countries could cooperate to both create obligations on states and incentivize particular actions by non-states. And those could have a significant financial impact as well. But I think the most important impact is debt. What we're seeing is in the international system, a lot of what we see from the IMF, from the World Bank, but also from the Green Climate Fund, it increases debt. It puts countries in a position where they have to continue to expand fossil fuel production. And we produced a report where we looked at all of the different climate finance initiatives and what was working and what wasn't. And one of the things we found is that there's also just such a massive timeline between the time where countries apply for something for a project and when they get money. With the Green Climate Fund, it's 3 to 4 years. Well, the world changes very fast in 3 to 4 years. So they may have proposed a project and they finally get the funding for it or the loan for it. Most of it's loans, not grants. And then the world has changed by the time they finally get their hands on the money. So debt management and alleviating fiscal constraints from debt is going to be critical. This can be done in a number of ways. We're looking at a design for a debt resolution facility to help members assess and then renegotiate their debts. A lot of countries and specific administrations are coming into power and they have this huge historical debt. They just don't even know where it comes from. When Ecuador did a bunch of years ago, debt assessment and resolution, they actually were able to bring down their debt, I think, by 60% because it was being calculated wrong over the years, which was adding up. And but there's also, I'm excited by the idea of debt conversions. And so what this means is kind of creating new mechanisms to enable sovereign-led and better deals. So a debt for renewables swap, a debt for nature swap, a debt for climate, keeping carbon in the ground swap. We've started to look at these. We've created a finance panel of experts that are only from the Global South. And there's a great report that just came out, actually written by the former head of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago for us, which looks at the idea of debt for renewables swaps, specifically in the Caribbean region, using that as a model for how that could work in other places. And I think that's one of the most exciting financial proposals on the table and was discussed at length in Santa Marta. If people are interested, all of our finance reports, which explain a lot of these ideas, are free on our website, fossilfueltreaty.org.
Perfect. Now, I just want to check in for time, and if you are happy to take a couple more questions.
Sure.
Perfect. So
They're such good questions.
yeah, there's a lot. So I'm trying to go through them in order, and then also sifting them together as best I can. But the next one is really interesting. This is something that I haven't personally heard anything about. So if you have anything to say, it'd be great. Richard asked, was there any mention of the role that the military plays in the use of fossil fuels and the production of GHGs? The military has been excluded from discussion since Kyoto Protocol, and do you think that this can be overcome?
In fact, for the first time, there actually was a lot of discussion. And I think it's, of course, because all the devastating wars that the world has been facing in the last couple of years, and a recognition of the impact. There was, for the first time that I had heard, some discussions about redirecting money, and so both impact of the world's militaries and of wars on fossil fuels and pollution, but also funding for the military. But actually, in some ways, a little less tangible and I think more interesting was a deep conversation about how the fossil fuel economy leads to war. And geopolitical destabilization and concentrated power in the hands of a few. And I've read quite a bit on that in academic literature. There's been kind of like very left conferences that I've gone to that have had those conversations, but to see countries was actually pretty exciting. And President Petro gave this speech. It's worth looking up the transcript from Santa Marta that linked climate change, fossil fuel phase out to the concentration of power, violence, war, and capitalism. And I have never heard a president of a country do that before. Like it was a revolutionary speech about how the fossil fuel system has grown out of power system that concentrates power in the hands of a few and that perpetuates inequality, and how breaking this cycle is the key to addressing so many of these other issues. I'm extrapolating that also means the dramatic expansion and funding and impact also of the world's and specific countries' militarism. I think it's these crises are interconnected, and the fact that decision makers are talking about that for the first time is really interesting, because this isn't about shifting from one widget to another. The mistake we've often made is talking about climate as though it's just a technological challenge. This is about power. It's about who holds power, who benefits, and how our systems are designed to continue to concentrate that power. And I think that that's why the fossil fuel industry is fighting so hard, because renewable energy is by its very nature distributed. No one owns the sun and the wind. This is an existential threat to the fossil fuel industry, because their structure is about keeping us dependent, ensuring that more mining is necessary, more fossil fuels are necessary. Once you have the car, you need to continue to feed it with fossil fuels. Once you have the coal plant, you need to continue to feed it with coal. Well, the sun doesn't send you a bill at the end of the month. And that is an existential crisis for the industry. So it really is about power. Sorry, you asked about the military, but it's all connected in my mind somehow.
It is all connected. That's how I think as well. So I understand. I'm going to give you two more questions, and then I think maybe we can just see how you're doing, because I would also just like to give you a chance to just give some final reflections, and if there's anything else on your mind that I'm sure you must be tired at this point of repeating yourself, but if there's any other things you wanted to give. But I'm just going to give you two questions that they're quite different, but I think that they could be paired together in an interesting way. So this first question that we have here says, to what extent is Prime Minister Carney's weakening of climate policies driven by a concern about the separatist movement in Alberta? And what would you advise that Carney do to deal with Alberta's demand for a new pipeline to the Pacific?
First of all, I don't have all the answers. And I think that anyone who says that they do at this moment in history, given what we've all experienced in the last couple of years, which has felt like some kind of weird bad B movie that it wasn't even viable, they're lying, right? Like this is a world that we're all just trying to keep up to and trying to understand. And so anything is possible. I would have said a couple of years ago, separatism in Alberta, whatever. Given the rise of the right in the United States and the far right in many other countries in the world, you know, as a prime minister, he has to take all of this seriously. That's right. However, I think the mistake that both he is making and that Trudeau made, and Notley herself made actually, is by reinforcing their message box. So what I mean by that is that, you know, there is no way an NDP government or a Liberal government is ever going to out pipeline a Conservative government. They're not. And so, but I think the mistake that they're all making is by reinforcing the framework that needing more pipelines is essential, that needing more oil is essential, needing more fossil fuels is essential. This is the message that the industry wants. And by continuing to reinforce that message, you undermine any policies to develop a clean energy economy that you may have wanted. So the industry wants us to fear moving away from fossil fuels, to fear scarcity, to fear price, et cetera. That's been their framework for decades. And I think that we have seen the Carney administration, Trudeau, Notley, and others, and the Eby administration reinforce that. So I think it's really interesting what we're seeing in other places in the world, especially in Europe, but we also saw it some from Gavin Newsom in California, where he said, look, of course we're currently dependent on fossil fuels, but we don't need to be. And actually our lives will be cleaner and we'll save more lives and our lives will be more affordable when we're not. So we have to do this together. And we're going to have to phase it out. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that in a way where we're still strong, but we can do this, creating a common sense of purpose, not reinforcing that the only way to economic prosperity is to build more of this stuff. It is, I think, essential to getting out of this in the long term. Given the threat of climate change right now and how much it will impact our lives in the future, and ask anyone who's had to move from the fires of the floods already, it will impact our lives. I mean, I lived through the heat dome in British Columbia. 800 people died in 24 hours. 1 billion boiled seafood washed up on our beaches. It was the most disgusting, horrific thing I'd ever seen in my life. And that was in Canada. More of this is coming, and it is coming, and we will contribute to ensuring that it gets worse and not show the leadership that can inspire other countries if we continue, if Carney continues on this frame and this message box. I think we have a responsibility, and I think elected officials have a responsibility to inform the public in the way they did during COVID. You know, I think we should have a public science officer who is actually saying what's really happening, and to create like they always say, well, there's not a political will for, we don't have enough people. There's the potential of Alberta leaving, and there's the potential, people aren't really supporting it. So help people understand to support it. Why is your advertising reinforcing the need for pipelines instead of telling people that fossil fuels are the threat to us? Right? The Netherlands just banned any fossil fuel advertising. And one thing that we haven't talked about, which I think is important to understand, is that the highest court in the world just actually made the International Court of Justice ruled after years and enormous analysis that new fossil fuel expansion is actually illegal. That will have impacts in climate litigation in Canada in the future. But we have actually a legal and moral responsibility to address this. How do you address it without ensuring a massive backlash in Alberta is one of the biggest problems that any politician will ever face in Canada. But they make it worse every day by reinforcing that we have to see expansion. And they make it worse for the people of Alberta by not planning for a phase out. Our world will shift and is shifting. to renewable energy. Last year, there was $2 trillion invested in renewable energy and only $1 trillion invested in fossil fuels. The world's economy has already flipped. Double the amount of renewables than what was invested in fossil fuel investment is still a big problem, let me tell you. But the fact that we are investing more globally in renewables, that there are some countries like Ethiopia that have already banned the fossil fuel car, that you can buy cheap electric cars now in many countries in the world, especially China. You can buy electric car cheaper than you can buy a fossil fuel car now in some countries. Solar panels from China are so cheap that we saw a 40% increase in solar panels in Pakistan in 1 year. Every house bought them. And so this renewables and electrification are now changing whole economies. And so that will mean that the future of the oil industry is limited. And the sooner that we plan for it, the sooner that we care for workers and communities in Alberta. And by not having the courage to actually say that, every politician, regardless of their policies, they've made it worse because they've decreased their political space to act. It's easy for me to say. I'm not a politician.
It's just this last question.
That's why.
Please don't feel free to like I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this question touches on what you just mentioned, which is what would your nation building project to increased cost-efficient ways to produce energy like solar cells, wind, geothermal, and hydrogen? And is China a model for what the world needs?
Yeah, what's happening in China is so exciting. I mean, no one ever thought that the both the production of renewable energy and batteries, et cetera, for the world and electric cars. I mean, the production levels are out of this world, but also the adoption of infrastructure and how quick it is. It's worth taking a look at. I'll give a plug actually for my husband's newsletter. I don't know if people know Chris Hatch, journalist from the National Observer, is my husband, and he writes a weekly column called Zero Carbon in the National Observer. And I learned so much about it, and I swim in this soup every day. But he did a deep dive some episodes ago on China and outlining what China is currently doing, and it just blew me away. They also did some great reporting from Santa Marta on Canada, actually, and some other issues. But I think it's worth looking at. I think the most important, I think there, in terms of nation building projects in Canada, you know, the grid is critical. So that means, like, if we are going to move more of our transportation system, more of our heating system onto electrification so that we reduce our own use of fossil fuels, then we need a stronger grid. We need people to be able to feed back to the grid from the solar panels on their roofs. We need an east-west grid that connects us, because each of our provinces, we actually have too small a population for the capital investment from private capital that we need. So when you add it all together, we don't. And so we need that connectivity across the country. That's going to be really critical. We need transportation infrastructure for electrification. People have range anxiety. We need to get rid of that. We need to make sure that we advertise that it is possible. There are some countries that are just not building any more gas stations, and they're only building electrification gas stations with cafes above, so you can sit and wait. You know, there's a car in China that can now that can. It's called the Zeekr, and it can fuel up. It's a fully electric car that can charge up in 10 minutes to go 700 kilometers. The technology is there now. It's incredible. We need to embrace it, and we need to create the infrastructure for Canadians to access it. And actually, that will create more political space to actually stop expansion of oil and gas as well. Because even though our problem is actually replacing the exports, and we have to deal with that, people are going to support those types of policies if they can get rid of the fear, if they can see that the world is here now where renewables are accessible and it's possible and it's not, because you hear so much junk out of Alberta and Daniel Smith about how it's not viable. And, even Notley, when we did our speech off in Alberta years ago, referred to the vision I was painting of the world as unicorn. What was her line? It was so good. She really had the best line that day. She said something like, here in Alberta, we ride horses, not unicorns, Sephora. It's just a great line. I had to give her that. But the fact is, I was actually quoting from what countries are currently doing. Like, we have these crazy blinders on. There are countries in the world that are getting the majority of their energy from renewable energy now. There are countries in the world where the majority of cars bought are electric now. The future is not the future. It is here. It is happening. And it's not happening in Canada because we have crappy policies that don't support it. And we should be giving the population the access to that. So I would focus on transportation. I would also focus on public infrastructure for transportation. All of our buses in this country should be electric. We should be looking at big projects like trains to get people off highways, especially with short connectivity. Montreal to Toronto, why do we not have high-speed rail there? That's ridiculous. And accessible transportation across the country to reduce aviation, to reduce people in cars and highways. And that's really critical. And electric. I mean, when you travel around the world, it is amazing what's out there, how fast and quiet the electric trains are. One of the things I noticed when I was in Denmark recently was that I was walking by a construction site and it was completely quiet. And I was like, what? And then I realized that it was completely quiet because all the vehicles were electric. And what an interesting benefit. Like, the cities are quieter. They're calmer. The birds are come back. It's so fascinating. We don't really talk about all of those benefits as well.
That's wonderful. Susan, do you have any comments to make? Because I've been I've been going through all the questions.
Right. It is just stunning. Your brilliance. Thank you for sharing your brilliance with us, Sephora. It's very clear. I have understood from what you said that we need a lot less news from the United States and a lot of more news from all the other parts of the world that are doing such fascinating things that we know nothing about. Although I do read Chris Hatch occasionally and a few Mike Udema on LinkedIn. We get some of this information, but it's not mainstream information. It doesn't seem to be understood that there's a lot going on that is different from what we've been led to believe. So thank you again. It was
You're
wonderful.
welcome.
And yeah.
Before we conclude, Susan, would it be okay if I just quickly address some of these questions? Because I think I can do some of them really quickly.
All
I just
right.
found the list here. First of all, Canada agreed to nothing in Santa Marta, FYI. Someone's asking, what did Canada agree to? They agreed to nothing. In fact, we're the only country that managed a speech from the floor at a fossil fuel phase-out conference without saying the word fossil fuels. It was tremendously embarrassing. China was not in Santa Marta. I don't know why, because Colombia and the Netherlands were not very public about their criteria of which countries they invited. So they only invited a certain number of countries. I think it was 70 and 60 said yes. And why they invited which countries is confusing to me. But in talking to Tuvalu, I understand that they're going to put actual criteria out and a list of countries that are being invited. And I know they're considering China. It's difficult, right? China's doing amazing things on renewables. They're also one of the largest independent financiers of fossil fuels around the world, right? The only reason Ecuador's drilling in the heart of the Amazon right now is because of a debt for oil swap with China. So China's a kind of interesting case when it comes to fossil fuels. It's an above and. Someone's asking me where I am, which organization I'm with. I co-founded Stand.Earth. I still support them as much as I can, given my work with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Stand.Earth works on LNG and fracking in British Columbia. It also works on climate policy, shipping, cleaning up the shipping industry, and protection of old growth forests, and has an IT campaign and a really interesting campaign on the fashion industry. I had no idea. Some of the companies that I thought were so good in the industry actually have some of the worst climate policies, and they produce a report card with the major fashion brands. Kind of interesting. So Stand.Earth, one of the organizations I founded, and now I'm spending almost all of my time with the fossilfueltreaty.org, which is another organization I founded to create this new treaty that would be a companion to the Paris Agreement. And someone asked about plastics. Absolutely. That's one of the ways that industry is creating more demand right now, is pushing new petrochemical infrastructure and plastics around the world. A lot of great organizations that work on that issue. Off the top of my head, I can say Center for International Environmental Law, CL, check their website. They've got some really great stuff on plastics. And then someone was talking about mining somewhere in that chat, and I'll address that as one, maybe the final thing. It's really important for people to understand because the industry has been fear-mongering around alternatives. They're just as bad. In fact, they're worse. There's a meme going around that shows tar sands, and it's like a pretty picture of reclamation or something. And then it shows a lithium mine, and it says, here's your renewable energy in your electric cars, you know, and it's trying to make the industry is paying for these ads to reduce support for renewable energy and electrification. I am not saying that critical mineral mining is not right now a huge problem. I don't think the rules are in place to ensure that we're protecting biodiversity, water, and most importantly, indigenous rights and human rights in mining. And I think that is a huge problem. I think we also need rules in place for closed loop systems. 90% of lithium can be recycled. A lot of these minerals can be recycled. And if we had legislation requiring closed loop systems, we would be able to use the minerals that are already on the surface of the earth and under deployment again and again. And that needs to happen before we open up a lot more areas to critical mineral mining. However, it's really important that people understand that the fossil fuel economy takes 565 times more mining than the clean energy economy. 565. Because when you have a piece of fossil fuel infrastructure, you have to mine every day to feed it with more fossil fuels. When you have a piece of clean energy infrastructure, it's then fed by the sun and the wind. So the infrastructure has to be produced once. So of course, there's a lot more mining for fossil fuels. It is not an equivalent impact. And I think we have to be really careful on that because we definitely have seen a lot of pushback against renewable energy and electrification, which could slow momentum on fossil fuel phase out. And then just on Santa Marta, I want to end by saying I hope it makes you as hopeful as me. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and it really did feel like a historic breakthrough. And yes, I know it's just a conference, but the conversation was different. It felt like it peeled back the curtain on the issues that had been so intransigent for so long, and it created a new pathway. It's like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? And I feel like that's what we've been doing with the climate negotiations. And so this new track and the incredible momentum behind the fossil fuel treaty is really giving me hope every day. You know, there were 900 submissions to the Santa Marta process from unions, from faith leaders, from cities, from subnationals, under two coalitions, C40. 80% of those submissions called for a fossil fuel treaty, for new governments and new governance and new tools. A third of the governments from the floor called for a fossil fuel treaty. The momentum is really growing around this, and I think that is really exciting. Of course, it's not going to be easy, but even having the conversations about creating new international cooperation to address the thing that threatens us most on Earth, that's exciting. And those conversations will change the ambition level, I believe, in a lot of different forums. So it's, you know, as Rebecca Solnit says, you can't just have hope because something is happening. Hope at this moment in history is something we all have to do together. So, you know, do what you can. And I mean that. Write to your MLA, and by endorsing the fossil fuel treaty or whatever organization that speaks to you, it speaks to your heart. But at this moment in history, don't just sit around and read about it. Think about what you're going to do and how you're going to contribute, because we need all hands on deck.
Wow, Zipporah, I can't thank you enough. Just not even for today, but just for all the work that you've done. This is a new space for me. I'm still young and I'm still exploring all these new spaces, and just to see the incredible amount of work still happening despite everything, for someone like me is just so, so encouraging. And the comments in the chat are also reciprocating that as well. Everyone, Liz says that this is the most hopeful event that I've attended in some time. So I really hope that you can leave here today knowing that you have made a lot of us feel better, and have given us hope. So I really appreciate that.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Zipporah.
Thank you again. Fabulous.
Take
All
care,
right.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.